There are exactly 3,214 people who apply to the Auror program every year. 12 get in. You send your application on a Tuesday morning. 7 NEWTs, all high marks, outstanding in defense against the dark arts. The parchment smells like the ministry, ink, old stone, and something faintly metallic you can't quite name. You seal it, hand it to your owl, and tell yourself you're not nervous. You are, of course. You've wanted this since you first read the word in a library book and understood, in the way you understand things that feel inevitable, that it was the only job that made any sense. By Friday, there's a response, an invitation to be evaluated, 2 words apart from an acceptance and somehow further away than that. The Ministry of Magic is larger than you expected and quieter than it should be. A witch in burgundy robes leads you down the corridor of level 2 without a word of small talk. You pass the Auror headquarters, a long room full of maps pinned to boards, stacked case files, half-empty cups of cold tea, and the particular restless energy of people who don't sleep enough and have stopped complaining about it. 3 Aurors stand outside a briefing room, mid-conversation. They don't look like the ones in the history books. The history books show them as legends, decorated, larger than life. These ones look like people who've seen things that permanently change the shape of their thoughts and learn to keep working anyway. One of them has a scar that starts below his ear and disappears into his collar. He doesn't look at you. You look at him longer than you mean to. The evaluation takes 2 days. Written examinations on dark magic theory, counter-curse legislation, tracking methodology, the history of dark wizard activity across Britain and Europe going back to Grindelwald. Then a practical assessment. Enchanted dummies that cast back, spell combinations you have to read before they fire, a sequence specifically designed to make you panic. Most candidates apparently panic. Then a psychological interview with an examiner trained in legilimency, who asks you questions that seem simple and straightforward and are neither. Why do you want this? You give the honest answer, the one underneath the impressive answer, underneath the language about duty and justice and protecting people, all of which is true, but none of which is the thing underneath. The honest one, the one you've never quite said out loud before. The examiner doesn't react. You have no idea if that's good or bad. On the 3rd day, a letter arrives at your flat. 2 sentences. You've been accepted into the Auror training program. Report to level 2, Monday, 6 a.m. You don't sleep that weekend. It isn't anxiety keeping you awake. It's a specific feeling of standing at the edge of something that cannot be undone. Level 2, the trainee. The first thing they take is your wand. On the first morning, before anyone has explained anything, you stand in a bare stone room, wandless and blindfolded, while 2 senior Aurors circle you with instructions to be unpleasant. The exercise has no stated objective. That is the objective. You last 4 minutes before accidental magic breaks the blindfold. Your supervisor writes in her notes, instinctive under duress. You won't know that for 2 years. Training is 3 years long. It is the most difficult thing you will ever do, and it will not feel heroic while you're doing it. It will feel like controlled exhaustion. Like being tested in rooms where nobody tells you the test has started, by people who have already decided what they're looking for and are simply waiting to see if you have it. Concealment and disguise means holding a polydeuce shift through 6 hours of escalating physical discomfort, because in the field, you don't get to choose when the transformation ends. Stealth and tracking means following a moving target through Nocturne Alley for 4 hours without being spotted. And the target is a senior Auror who knows exactly where you are and is actively trying to lose you in the crowd. You pass Borgin and Burks twice. Between the first pass and the second, the window display changes. You note it without breaking stride. Weeks later, your supervisor tells you that single observation was a difference between a pass and a fail. The candidate before you missed it. The Moody method runs Tuesdays and Thursdays, one uninterrupted hour of defensive spell work against rotating senior Aurors who do not pace themselves for your benefit. The session is named after Alistar Moody, the most decorated Auror of the modern era, a man who filled half the cells in Azkaban by himself during the height of the First War, and who lost an eye, a leg, and a piece of his nose in the process. His portrait hangs in the Auror office. Most days it's asleep. On the days it's watching, the trainees work harder without being told to. Nobody admits this. Dark arts history is perhaps the most important discipline, and the one nobody expects to matter. Understanding signatures, how Grindelwald's followers marked their work differently from the Deet Eaters 30 years later, what the presence of the dark mark above a house tells you versus what its absence tells you, how dark magic has evolved across 2 centuries, and where the patterns of thinking behind it remain constant. Because dark wizards are methodical. They have goals and timelines and preferred methods. The only way to stop something methodical is to think more clearly than it does, and to start thinking before it makes its next move. By month 8, 5 of your cohort are gone. 3 left voluntarily. 2 were removed. Nobody explains either category. You notice the empty desks and you don't ask about them because you've already started to understand. An Auror's job is to observe everything and choose what to react to, and most things don't require a reaction. The strange part is that you don't find it lonely, you find it clarifying. You are becoming someone who sees the world differently than you did when you arrived. You're not sure yet whether that's a cost or a gift. Level 3, the Junior Auror. Your badge is real. Your independence isn't yet, and that's the design, not the criticism. Every operation, you work alongside a senior partner. She has 17 years of field experience and a way of communicating through silences that takes you months to fully read. You don't choose cases. You don't lead briefings. You observe, support, and develop the kind of instinct that no training room can manufacture. The instinct that comes only from being in the field, where variables don't behave like they do in controlled exercises, and where getting it wrong has weight. Your first real field call comes at 3 in the morning, a dark-marked sighting above a farmhouse in Yorkshire. By the time you arrive, the family has been evacuated. Alive? Barely. Your partner moves through the dark rooms as if she's done this 1,000 times, which she has. She stops at an interior doorway and raises one hand, and you freeze behind her, instantly, without knowing why. She points to the floor. There's a mark there, faint, partially disrupted, but unmistakable to anyone who has spent months cataloging exactly this kind of thing. A binding curse signature. Older variant. Last documented use, the First War. Someone was here recently. Someone who trained under the old regime and never stopped believing in it. You file a report that lists every detail. The scratched floor beside the mark, the specific smell of a disapparition that hadn't fully dissipated, the angle of scorching on the far wall that indicates where the caster was standing. You don't sleep that night. The thinking won't stop, and you've stopped wanting it to. Over the next 4 months, the same signature appears at 3 more locations across 2 different counties. You work it on your own time, cross-referencing incident reports nobody asked you to cross-reference. One morning, you put a map on your partner's desk. 7 locations, red marks, lines connecting them. You found this without being asked to look. She studies it for a long time without speaking. Good, she says. That's the whole conversation. At the next briefing, you're in the room. Level 4, the Auror. You work alone now, and the silence of it takes some getting used to. The cases on your desk are the ones that require patience over spectacle. A suspected dealer in cursed objects operating 2 streets from Nocturne Alley, a disappearance in Hogsmeade filed as accidental by the local constabulary, an address that 3 separate informants have named independently without knowing each other exist. That last one is the one that matters. You spend 4 days watching that address under a disillusionment charm. eating cold food, standing perfectly still for hours, learning the rhythms of the street, who arrives, at what time, carrying what, for how long. On the second day, a man enters carrying a case you recognize from the Yorkshire files. You follow him for 6 blocks through the back routes off Nocturne Alley, past shop fronts displaying things you stopped looking at directly during your second week of training. You don't close the distance once. You note the address he enters, the time, the second contact who meets him at the door. Then you leave. That night, you want badly to have gone back. You understand exactly why you didn't, and you sit with the discomfort of that, which is part of the job too. The arrest comes 10 days later, coordinated, clean, and quiet. Under questioning, the man gives up names. 3 Dark Wizard sympathizers who dissolved into ordinary life after the First War, still active, still connected to networks everyone assumed had rotted away. The kind of people who understood exactly when to go quiet and how long quiet needed to last before the world stopped looking. The files go up the chain. That evening, you realize you haven't spoken to your family in 3 weeks. You write a short letter. You don't mention the names in the files, or what finding them means, or why your hands weren't quite steady when you wrote the final report. Some things you carry alone. You've always known this, in the abstract. Now you know it the other way. Level 5, the Senior Auror. Leading sounds like it should feel different from following. What it actually feels like is that the weight of every decision has doubled, because now the decisions aren't only about you. Your team is 4 Aurors. The youngest is exceptional under pressure and has a consistent tendency to move before situations fully resolve. She acts on instinct the way very gifted people often do, trusting it too completely. The one beside her is cautious to the point where caution has become its own category of risk. You spend more time managing the gap between their approaches than you spend on the actual casework, which tells you something about what leadership really is. Your unit is assigned a long-running surveillance operation, a network suspected of moving dark artifacts across Britain and into mainland Europe, connected to names from 2 wars, 3 months of intelligence work before a single arrest, maps on the wall, names connecting to other names connecting to other names. A web that reveals new edges every time you think you've reached the perimeter. The raid on a warehouse off Diagon Alley happens at 2 in the morning on a cold November night. Your youngest Auror moves before the signal. The target fires first. Nobody is seriously hurt, but the margin is close enough that you don't feel it until you're standing outside in the cold air writing the scene report by wandlight. And then it arrives all at once, what almost happened playing through your mind in precise detail. The conversation that follows is the one that doesn't get written in any report, but matters more than any that does. You tell her you recognize exactly what she did because you did the same thing yourself once in a different corridor with a different target years ago. You were lucky in a way that had nothing to do with skill or preparation or anything she could control. It wasn't courage, you tell her, it was impatience. And impatience in this job doesn't only cost you, it costs whoever is standing beside you. She listens. You remember sitting where she's sitting, hearing something very close to these same words and not wanting to hear them. Level 6, the War Auror. He's back. The ministry spent 18 months officially, publicly, elaborately denying it. The statements from Fudge's office grew more detailed and more forceful as the evidence grew harder to dismiss, which is exactly how you know the evidence had become impossible to ignore. Then the graveyard. Then Potter's account. Then the disappearances, the specific patient signature of something organized and old and very confident in its own return. The Auror office changes the way institutions always change when they're afraid, in increments that each appear defensible in isolation. Expanded detention authority, warrant provisions extended under urgency clauses whose definitions quietly widen over months, memos from Fudge's office, then from Umbridge's, each building on the last. What they are constructing, collectively, brick by careful brick, you recognize from the history files. You know what it looked like when this happened in the 1970s. You know how those choices were justified at the time. You know what they cost. Colleagues disappear from the ranks, some reassigned, some pressured out, some simply gone in ways nobody explains. You attend 2 funerals in a single month. You write the reports, you draw lines around what orders you will and won't follow, and you hold those lines, and you watch other people make different calculations, and you understand that refusing an order doesn't remove the order. It simply means someone else executes it, possibly further than you would have. What makes Voldemort genuinely dangerous, beyond the raw power, beyond the followers, beyond the fear, is that he understands institutions. He knows that a government under enough pressure will compromise itself. He knows that good people, given enough time and enough justification, will become things they wouldn't have recognized at the beginning. He doesn't need to defeat the Ministry of Magic. He needs it to defeat itself first and then walk in through the open door. You are still standing. You are still drawing the same lines you drew at the start. That matters, even when it doesn't feel like enough. Level 7, the head Auror. You didn't want the position. That, apparently, is why they offered it to you. The Auror office after the Battle of Hogwarts is intact and compromised at the same time, full of people who made very different choices under pressure and now have to find a way to work alongside each other. Kingsley Shacklebolt, the new Minister for Magic, needs someone who knows the inside of this institution well enough to fix it without dismantling what still works. Someone who isn't interested in the title or the credit. The first year is almost entirely personnel. Who stays? Who is quietly moved to roles without operational authority, as structural correction rather than punishment? Who pairs with whom and why? Decisions that look administrative from the outside and are actually something closer to careful surgery. You learn things in this year that you couldn't have learned in any other because you are seeing the whole machine for the first time, from above, understanding how the parts failed each other. You rebuild the training program's psychological evaluation from the ground up. The existing component, testing performance under pressure, stays. What you add is different. Scenarios designed to test what candidates do when an institution tells them something is acceptable and every instinct they have says otherwise. How they handle the gap between official sanction and personal judgment. Whether they have the clarity to act correctly in that space when the cost of acting correctly is real. You design that module yourself because you understand exactly what it needs to catch. You watch what happened when it wasn't there. Harry Potter joins the post-war intake. You've read his file, as you've read every file. His is extraordinary in the expected ways and complicated in the ways you also expected. You assign him a senior partner who will not be impressed by his history, his reputation, or anything except the quality of his work on any given day. He turns out to be fine, more than fine in time, but he needs the same thing every good Auror needs most, someone who makes them earn it every day without exception. One morning you walk through the office and stop. There's a trainee at the wall map, 7 locations, red marks, connections drawn carefully between them in 2 different colors, something they found themselves without being asked to look, on their own time. You were that person once, standing at a different map, in a different war, with the same feeling of finding a pattern nobody else had noticed yet, and not knowing quite what to do with the certainty that you were right. You don't say anything. You let them work. The Auror office has never been a perfect institution, and it will not become one. But this morning, it is doing what it was built to do, finding the things that need to be found by people trained and tested and trusted to find them. People who chose this work knowing what the choice would cost. That's enough. For today, it's enough.